Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our regular Monday Mish-Mashing Battle Lounge. I am Kanzuki Dynasty. I have here Rillian, and our lounge is open for you. We are restreaming, of course, from my personal channel to our 2_MK team channel, where you can find all of our content every day of the week. And if you want to join our lounge, just pull up your search, put in 3 rounds first to 2 with character select off, and look for Rune Siren.
Round 1. Fight!
This week we are continuing our look at style relative to our new zoner incoming. Falk will be released tomorrow, and Falk's style, while not completely defined, we're going to assume that Falk is the zoner by most standards of it. She doesn't seem like the sort of character who's going to be playing close in that much. She might have some good pressure at certain situations, depending on how good her various ulti, meaties, whatever it is you call them, wake up pressure. Depending on how good those are, we might get some good stuff in terms of her ability to pressure people. But her mechanics and execution as a whole indicate to us that she's probably not going to be too pressury. So we know that she has very zonery buttons, good space control, and she may be able to frustrate people because she does have just enough moves to be non-linear. That's the key to a frustration character, that you need to be able to trick someone into thinking you're going to do 2 different things from a particular range, one of which is usually a terrible, unsafe idea, but beats a ton of stuff that would be sensible on your opponent's side. Zoners don't always have options like this, but Falk in particular might have some good stuff here. Particularly the ability to output with her V-Trigger 2. What I expect to happen is rather that she'll be a lot more able to keep people out, but not indefinitely. She's much more the style of character like Guile, who can keep people out and then cause a reaction from them that she can easily deal with. She has the same sort of long, forward, anti-air special. It lacks some of the efficacy of Flash Kick, but the EX version is very likely to be useful regardless. So we are probably expecting a lot of Falk that play outright runaway style zoning, because she does seem to be a character who does have some good options for that. She gets to keep her mobility while charging her various fireballs, and because she can do them in the air, she's not limited to being able to use them just by staying on the ground. It is for this reason that we expect Falkbot to involve a lot of aerial stuff, because she's the first character so far who can really put pressure on you for that. Who can move away from you in the air and still attack with a zoning tool. So, obviously, let's look at the options for fighting that type of character, and also to see other characters who are specifically not like that, who are functionally still zoners. Sakura is capable of it, decently. She has to do a bit more anticipation than other characters in order to zone well, but she counter zones well enough that she has some good options. Ryu is our quintessential zoner, But much like Falk has to rely on very specific methods and spacing for countering the opponent that approaches through the zoning correctly. Fortunately, he's relatively strong at this, and most of the complaints you'll hear about Ryu's tier or how powerful a character he is don't really have to do with Ryu's defenses, rather the idea that he lacks the ability to get anything started in a game where sometimes your opponent can offer explosive pressure against you. He's the sort of character where once he loses the life lead, it can be hard to get it back, basically. But even Ryu can force the issue somewhat with his chip damage and good knockdown stuff. Because he does actually have some good knockdown stuff, it's just that getting to that good knockdown stuff from his base game plan can be a little harder to do. So far, our lounge also contains a Nash, however, I'm not really sure how good their connection is to the other players in the lounge at the moment. Hopefully it will be a little better when we get back out of this match. Oh, they left. Now, we expect this to be at least a bit laggy, not specifically because of anything related to Street Fighter V, but ping is ping, you can't do that much. But here we have the quintessential Brazilian Lara. Let's see if we can get a match that is not too stressful. So Ryu's ability to zone Lara at the very beginning of matches is really good. She can do nearly nothing about it. Until Lara has meter, you can just throw fireballs the entire time, you don't care. The key, of course, is understanding how to change and shift your fireball game enough that she won't just jump over them all. Or to be the sort of person who really doesn't care to the point where you just go, oh, I'll let you jump over them all. This is because Ryu builds up a very tiny amount of meter for throwing fireballs, whereas Lara builds up no meter at all for jumping over them. So if you really want to just do it, by all means, just do it. In the end though, you have to be absolutely assured that Lara will jump over the fireball eventually. That's the key to this matchup, understanding your own fireball timing enough to know Lara's spacing, to understand when you will need to Shoryuken, and how far away you need to stand to set up the situation where you get to Shoryuken. Because as you've just seen demonstrated, if you find the right spacing, you get stuff, and if you find the wrong spacing, you get the option for Lara to do her overhead at a safe range for her. Not something you want happening. So you absolutely have to spend most of your time expecting that you need to uppercut. But this is a good example of a player whose aim is to be frustrating. And this type of player is Amara's relative weakness. But one can turn even this sort of thing to advantage if you understand how the game works. Because if your opponent's aim is to frustrate you, and you realize you can't avoid being frustrated, what you can do is change your mental frustration response from I'm going to take this action to I'm going to take this other action. The standard frustration response of most players in this game is to hit buttons and try to do something. But a frustration player is very similar to a pressure player in that they know how to make that not work. They spend a lot of time learning how to make that in particular not work. So every time you refuse to just block, you end up dead. They set you up for many, many things. The concept is just block. Because in order for a frustration player to successfully condition you, they must force the situation enough times to be relatively certain of what they want to do next. It is also easy for you to become twitchy when you're in that situation because you keep on feeling as if you don't get to do anything. The optimal situation for you in all fighting games when you are frustrated like that or when you're facing a frustration player is to stop trying to counterattack early into their block string and wait for the end. This was something we also mentioned on Thursday in our Kame House lobbies. Conceptually, if you block until you understand what their plan is, you can then try to figure out whether or not their plan has a counter. If you hit buttons, most likely the frustration will build, and because they may in fact have more than one, it will end up feeling random and becoming stressful. Now obviously most of us think, well, this is a command grab character, I probably shouldn't just block. But let's look at that from the emotional perspective. What is really so frustrating about being hit by a command throw that you expected to hit you? The answer is probably nothing, so just wake up and block. If you are able to get calm enough to spend time learning your opponent's approaches and block strings instead of pushing on that frustrated feeling and wanting to hit buttons in their face all the time, frustration players can be dismantled if they aren't creative. Creative ones, obviously, are much stronger and you have to pay some attention to them. But we are seeing here, for example, that Kazuki Dynasty's response to a lot of her stuff is hit more buttons, when this isn't really a useful response to have to Lara in the first place. However, it is absolutely true that a player can be frustrated enough to fall for things that they shouldn't be getting hurt by. This, for example, if you have fought Omni Rabbit, you know that that works a very specific way. And we actually have a whole concept. That particular sequence was an idea to go into the Lara bot. We know how that works. But if you get frustrated because I don't get to do anything, my opponent is hitting buttons and I'm not getting to act, then you probably will end up losing. The solution to that is just to backdash out of the stand medium kick. It's kind of strange, but we've done the research and know that when Lara is doing that particular sequence at that particular speed, almost every character in the game can just backdash on reaction to being hit by the medium kick. Some of them can straight up walk out of it, but most, if not all of them, can at least be relatively sure they're going to backdash. note that overall though, that whole sequence was not that disadvantageous to Kansuki Dynasty's play or to her chances of winning the round. When you're facing your frustration player, the number one thing you have to understand about them is that they have built an entire style around psychologically taking apart your response options. Depending on the game, this may mean that blocking is not the response you need to do. It might be in certain matchups that you need to backdash or neutral jump or any number of other things. But overall, in Street Fighter specifically, until it's proven to you that you can't block them indefinitely, block them indefinitely. Part of the reason why this is useful for us is that this is actually almost exactly the same as Kata 33 after a while. Lara has no options that will reach you without being whiff punishable after you backdash out of her medium kick. Almost every character is at complete advantage in that situation. But the more important thing is, once you've gotten a frustration player to that point, they pause more. They look for other things to do, much like this. And you get a better and better idea of how to deal with them because their primary option, whatever it was they chose to start with, was probably chosen because it was the safest and or easiest way to do the thing in question. It was the most simple, frustrating option. When a frustration player loses the ability to put you on edge with their playstyle, the match becomes fair almost automatically. At that point, it is a matter of either your matchup knowledge or the amount of effort that they have put into finding different ways to make your stuff not work.
It's go time. Let's do this.
However, it is also easy, as you've just seen demonstrated, to get so caught up in trying to figure out the second part of defense after you've been put in this situation that you can even forget that you have a first part. This normally happens because we don't have the belief that the player will keep doing the same thing. This makes frustration players some of the hardest players to get past in early tiers of Street Fighter because they are absolutely the person who will have fun doing the same thing to you over and over just to see if you can respond to it.
Fight.
Conceptually, therefore, you're facing a player who will absolutely win an entire round by doing something like, as you've just seen, a jumping forward into command throw. The fault that many players have in that situation is that they fear that the player is going to try something else, and therefore that the jump is not the first thing on their mind anymore. This makes sense because a frustration player's style is intended to create a particular emotional reaction, and that reaction will almost always be one where you don't feel as if the thing they are doing is the thing they're actually trying to achieve. You end up feeling this is a trick. This is a trick and they're going to snap any moment and do a ton of damage or whatever else and make my life miserable. This is one of the first things you have to get over in fighting games. The idea that your opponent has many options and they're just waiting for that right moment to unleash their new tech on your unsuspecting character and do a ton of damage. It is not that this is not true. It is not that these people and these styles don't exist. It is that feeling as crippled by them as many people end up feeling is a heavy detriment to your growth in fighting games. Losing a round because you didn't know a mix-up, especially in our current age of being able to just go watch the replay, means that you basically get to have new counter tech of your own to develop. You can send them to us and we'll help make bots for you to deal with them if our bots don't cover them already. All of those things are easy options for you now. This is no longer the arcade where your quarter is lost, your turn is gone. You don't get to play anymore because someone did the same thing to you until you got frustrated. And with that, you gain the ability to level up if you can stay calm enough. But this only happens if you give yourself enough time to figure out what the problem was, to learn how you lost, and more importantly, to play in such a way that will lead to you being able to check and find that information later. This is super difficult against lots of people, especially higher level people, where you don't feel as if you know your character's options that well and they're just picking you apart because they seem to know them better than you. But even a frustration player relatively high level over you can be forced to take certain actions if you, in turn, stick to your own game plan. You can maximize the amount of learning you can do by doing this.
Round one. Fight.
This is another one of the good reasons to go online to play ranked, sometimes even when you don't feel as if you're going to rank up. As always, our advice is to play casuals until you start to win the majority of your matches in casuals. Then that's probably an indicator that the matchmaking, well, based on your rank points. Either the matchmaking is poor in your area, or you need more rank points. Part of the reason why frustration players are so effective is that they negate a lot of your training. Most of us train on reactions and spacing and those things. The frustration player's style is based around understanding those things, understanding the conventions and expectations, and then violating as many of them as possible. It's different from a close-in or pressure player whose canned mix-ups or similar lead to those situations, because those people, you're literally guessing. They haven't worked out some magic formula for beating you based on emotionally messing with you as much. You can be conditioned, but conditioning takes time. A frustration player often has the idea of how to do this. They have the tools to do this to nearly anyone who challenges them at all at the wrong spot in their block string. Or let's call it pressure, but it isn't always really pressure. If you have invincible reversals or invincible moves, they're quite possible it's quite possible that they will be the way that you defeat that person entirely, without having to think about too much. And here we have another decent example of how you could have thought about this. Just as with last week, I was pointing out that the Guile player we saw last week was the sort of person that I would see playing Bison. Well, this Lara player, thank you Lara player for joining our lounge and helping with our demonstrations today, is absolutely the sort of person that plays Fang. Their way of playing would indicate that they play Guile or Nash or Fang. Fang is probably the least surprising. I would also expect that they had like a Pocket Vega.
Round one.
Because there's very few things that are more frustrating than just having to deal with all of Fang's zoning, but Fang's normals also do a really good job of deceiving other people. The spaces he can get into, the things he can set up, it would be very easy to feel as if it's my turn, I should be able to do something, and it not be true. That's how Fang works as a character. For example, that sweep doesn't look like you can punish it, and it has a weird block stun. It is his sweep. You should easily be able to punish it, but you have to understand it to do that. Therefore, the player is able to keep on hitting an extremely unsafe button with the expectation that because you just don't expect them to hit it, or because it is possible for both Fang and Colleen to have that button spaced in such a way that you can really do very little about it. They get to just keep on hitting sweep because you want to move, you want to do things. It's not your turn, but you don't know that, and that's how they function. And of course, the emotional feeling that follows from that is, oh look, I beat the sweep, I figured you out. But that's not their main tactic in the first place. They are just getting away with the easiest thing first, so that they can try after that. You can see it breaking down fairly easy here. It is a very calculated, clean, and to some extent extremely difficult style of play, actually. To know with almost certainty that you cannot be sure how to deal with something is an extremely frustrating feeling.
Round one.
And for those of us who don't think too heavily about this sort of game, we don't come up with immediate options for dealing with these. We don't think to ourselves, okay, I know what will probably fix this because I've dealt with this before. Because the moment it doesn't work, we lose our confidence in it and go, is that really a solution? Never let that happen to yourself. This sort of player is repetitive enough that you can probably watch the spacing sufficiently to learn it. You can watch their spacing for doing that thing enough to recognize when they can and cannot be countered for doing it. It takes the stress of adapting to people and adds the stress of understanding that certain moves are not what the frame data says. Certain moves change in terms of the properties of how well you can punish them, based almost entirely on the spacing. Fang has other good options such as deep jump-ins, as you saw there, that make it more and more difficult to set up certain situations. Similarly here, we have the emotional stressor of waiting to see how many times the opponent will hit the crouch medium punch, for example. After the second one, you can't actually parry it that easily anymore. But because most of us emotionally respond by waiting to see whether or not they hit the third one, we lose not because it's not possible to parry them in that chain, it's because you have to parry after the first. And parrying after the first is stressful. We want to be able to confirm that things are safe before we do more parrying. Or even invincible moves sometimes. Just counters if we know that the move is unsafe. We want to be sure that it's the right time to do it. And it's very difficult to push past this and say, you know what, I'm just going to parry straight out a block. I know you're going for it. Because we know it absolutely is true that they could take another path. They could simply not do that. It isn't really a guessing game because you do have some other good options with your character. But again, the frustration character is attempting to frustrate you. Their thought on how to play the match and how to play the game is about making you upset in the sense of not thinking about how to deal with them properly. This is the hardest part of fighting games to get over because it has nothing to do with physical training anymore. It's almost entirely your mental fortitude and your mindset that make this possible or impossible. This is the hump that most people face, the first big barrier to getting good. Because while you can learn every situation one by one, it takes a phenomenally long time in a game with 34 characters to memorize the correct response to every situation, especially when a crazy enough application of your opponent's abilities will break even that expectation. You'll have to start all over again. The key, therefore, is to focus inwardly and look at your character's tools and hit boxes and hurt boxes if you understand them decently well. If you don't and absolutely need to check something to be that technical, even if you didn't want to be that technical, at least try them out to see what will happen, because that might be enough. Trust the potential craziness of certain actions. This button might work even though it doesn't look like it should. Not trusting one's buttons is a very difficult thing to overcome in this game. But if you don't trust your buttons, you are lacking tools entirely. And when you lack tools in these games, it is easier to become frustrated, creating a loop against the same sort of player more and more. You feel as if there is nothing you can do. That in turn makes you feel as if you shouldn't try certain things because, well, obviously they can't be good ideas. They're not good ideas any of the rest of the time, so why would they be good ideas now? And you end up cutting yourself off from the thing that is potentially outright designed by the developers to be the solution to the situation in question, because you didn't understand the move well enough, you didn't trust it enough, so you just didn't try. So try not to let this happen to yourself, even though it is very difficult sometimes to feel that out correctly. To just look at a bad situation and go, I'm gonna do EX Tatsu here, because maybe that will save me. It could have a hitbox or a hurtbox that saves me. I don't know that it doesn't. Maybe I dodge attacks because I do this move. Entire styles, entire levels of development in fighting games come about because someone decided, I'm going to try this thing that no one has tried before because no one thought it was a good idea. It's very seldom that the reason that people don't take a particular approach is because it's actually too difficult to do it. The concept of new tech appears almost entirely because someone decided to do something daring or unconventional. But furthermore, that they went to the point of making sure that thing worked somehow. They looked for the situation in which this otherwise useless concept is a good idea. Now, at the core, especially when playing Sakura, Kanzuki Dynasty is also a frustration player. On her other characters, she's slightly less effective at it. For example, Cammy is not a particularly good character for frustration players because she's a little linear in certain situations. At lower levels you can manage, but once you learn things like where she actually has no pressure, or the fact that you can throw Hooligan on its way, or understanding exactly how to take a hit from Razor Edge Slicer so that you don't actually get anything meaningful off it when you have the life lead. All of those little things slowly break Cammy's ability to be frustrating. But Sakura doesn't have this problem. Sakura has all of the tools required to be a frustrating character. Otoshi gets her over a lot of things, doesn't look all that different from her regular jump, has 3 follow-ups, and an air throw. Well, a functional throw. I don't think it actually throws you if you're in the air.
Toshi's throw only works on grounded opponents, unfortunately. Although I do have the regular air throw if I jump forward.
Uh-huh.
At least I've never gotten it to work on an aerial opponent.
Okay.
Another example
I
right
wouldn't
there.
figure it would. I thought it might have been a height thing, but even then, it's probably not that big a deal. Could be... Well, we'll check it later actually. Maybe you can catch someone at the 4 frames of a backdash or something, but not someone who's actually higher in the air. Lots of options.
Well, I'm happy to test at any time.
But the strength of a frustration player like Kanzuki Dynasty with this character is that you can't make a lot of moves against Sakura. She can stick out her heavy punch, her light kick even. Her dash is practically unreactable. She's basically the new Nash in that regard. And unlike Nash, her overhead is incredibly good. Because it is a forward motion that looks like a ton of other stuff Sakura does. You can't be... In fact, I think her heavy punch and her overhead look almost the same in the first frames. Yeah, there you go. If you're learning to recognize motions Sakura is doing, our brains are incredible at their capacity to recognize different things on the screen over time, but that doesn't help you when the things are ambiguous. So Sakura can play an entire game off of just how confusing it is to try to counter her, stand heavy punch or overhead. On top of all that, you have to deal with her Tatsus as well if she decides to try to get in that way. Those are innately frustrating also because they're not actually unsafe for the most part.
You win.
So, how do you break down a character like this? That is about understanding what your good options are for taking away her ambiguity. Sakura is particularly good at being ambiguous because the opponent is trying to play footsies with her. For example, you can take advantage of the fact that, as just mentioned, for the most part, it's very difficult to get Otoshi to be particularly effective against aerial opponents. And while Sakura's air throw and her jumping heavy punch and jumping heavy kick and jumping medium kick, are very good at clipping people out of the air, she can't necessarily follow them up if that's all she did. She's much like Laura in that you don't care about anything she does if you neutral jump at a particular range. In fact, this is possibly the entire reason they bothered to give her the upward Hadouken in this game. There's a certain range where if you just neutral jump when Sakura is approaching you, you just probably win. Or you take very little damage. Because obviously she can see this happening and beat you. Because she has to have options of her own. But if you look at the damage you take, it's really not that good. For her, that is. You get to terrorize this character by doing this if the player does not understand the benefits of certain buttons of hers. The short version is, if you neutral jump against Sakura and you have decent buttons when you come back down or understand how to play certain spaces, it's just terrifying for her. Because it's too tempting to do a bunch of things to try to catch the opponent, which they could then mess with her in some way and defeat. At that point, you are out frustrating Sakura. If you ever feel nervous against Sakura, or Lara for that matter, just jump up, straight. Nothing else is required. If you're a zoning character, or a zoning style character, you have a way better option for this than most people, because if they back off, by virtue of you jumping, you've achieved your play goal. And if they happen to stand too close, zoning characters tend to have phenomenally good jumping heavy kicks. By definition, you can't do that much to them. This is able to throw off their spacing enough for you to get a lot of space of your own, and make them twitchy enough to approach you too quickly. When they approach you too quickly, all of your other footsie options reappear. Your stand heavy punch, your crouch medium kick. All of those things become possible because you're no longer trying to control a character with superior footsie buttons. You're trying to control someone dashing at you, which we all have a decent idea how to do by the time we are like 1500 rank points or something. We know how to deal with that. Zoners in particular have many more spacing options for this sort of thing than any other one else in the cast. And since they also tend to have decent counter zoning, she can't just throw fireballs at them either and hope they'll land on them. This can work, but it's probably not one of her best options.
I really do need to learn the combos from that.
There are a particular subset of characters who can almost always be defeated this way. Not necessarily at high level, because at the highest level, the frustration part of the game is happening invisibly. The players are playing out the entire frustration part in their own heads, and you're not seeing any of it. But to get there, they had to go through all this. So it helps to both make them more susceptible to zoning, less confident in their spacing, easier to whiff punish. You get a whole ton of options out of this, all for the price of risking, in Sakura's case, getting clipped by a medium Shoryuken or something. Her ways of dealing big damage to you from those neutral jumps, just not enough. She absolutely can deal the damage though. Another reason why this is so useful is because most of us, when we neutral jump, we don't feel the need to hit the button. Therefore, we have trip guard. Trip guard meaning that when you land, you can block instantly. It also means that technically you can backdash instantly in a way that helps when you expect to dash up throw or something. But that's not as useful because there are a lot of other things that come into that. However, your opponent might, like, throw too early, unlike buttons where that matters. And interestingly, this is probably one of the most important things we mentioned last week relative to Fault. We expect her to be able to do this particular tactic phenomenally. to the point where we have based most of the bot's current design or conceptual design around her neutral jumping. Because if she is as strong as we think, it's going to be a seriously strong tactic for her. Back jump will also help, but overall, I expect a lot of danger to come up because she can just jump straight up in the air and stick out very good buttons in front of her. I don't expect Sakura to even be able to reach her. Have you seen Falk's jumping medium punch? It's almost disgusting. And I play Chun-Li. It appears to be clearly on par with Chun-Li and Colleen's jumping, neutral jumping, heavy kick, and any jump, medium kick, respectively. It's going to be stressful. The thing to understand about frustrating a frustration player, though, is that they are mentally attuned to this well enough themselves that you can't get locked into that mindset. You can't keep thinking, I've got them now, I understand. These are people who specialize in deciphering and decoding frustrating tactics. So, when you counter one, they're just going to try their best to evolve to the next one. And since it is not unknown tactics, and since it is not execution-heavy stuff most of the time, it's just figuring out how best to make your life miserable with hitbox evasions and other things. There's not always anything you can do about it. They're affecting you mentally more so than they're doing anything relative to the game. They're just doing things that are really good decisions, but would be bad decisions in different situations. One good example here is that you can beat nearly all of Sakura's spaced pressure with light shoryuken, but in order to do that, you'd have to trust that Sakura was going to actually try to get to you, and therefore that the light shoryuken would be a good idea. A frustration player will go, okay, I'm just going to light shoryuken in neutral a ton, because they don't see any serious downside to just doing light shoryuken repeatedly, especially at medium ranges. Sakura might crush counter them, but they don't care. They are based around the idea that frustrating you is more important than keeping the life lead. So they'll just light shoryuken everything. They see you move at all and you get a light shoryuken. Because they also know that light shoryuken recovers pretty fast. If the opponent wasn't expecting the exact timing for it, they'll just not be able to crush counter you. Like, some characters basically can't do it at all. But you have to have that sort of mindset. A zoner is not the sort of person that sees an opponent moving at them and assumes, yeah, I'm just going to shoryuken. And probably make it. And you shouldn't necessarily try to make that part of your style as a person either. Amara, for example, is weak to frustration players because that's the opposite of the way she thinks. So by the time her opponent has gotten her to think, okay, fine, I'll be frustrating, they've already thought through what the most likely response they're going to get is, and figured out how to counter that. But if you can mentally keep it in mind overall, you still have a fairly potent weapon. Understanding how to keep up with this emotionally can be really hard. think we're at that point of recreation of lounge.
Yes, it sounds about right.
Okay, go ahead and do that.
No one else is here, so we'll be right back. And while we're at it, once again, if you want to join us, the settings are right on screen. 3 rounds, first to 2, character select is off. You can search for Rune Siren. And we're up.
It's go time. Let's do this.
So, as mentioned before, this isn't really about tech, because tech gives you some specific ways of responding to very specific situations. They're fairly crafted. They're katas, basically. Tech is about knowing this works right here, this is the reason it works. Frustration players don't care about tech, for the most part. They care about most ambiguous situations they can possibly find. Because ambiguity is a good way for them to get at least some advantage and put more and more pressure on the defending player. They may not always play very offensive characters, but depending on the options of the opponent, they're the sort of people who switch character a lot to make sure that whoever they're playing has a sufficiently frustrating option in the matchup to do something. Now the upside to this is that, as you can see, technically, especially in this form, Sakura doesn't actually have that much damage off most of her crush counters. She has some good damage off a lot of them, but the spacing required, if you're playing with her in neutral, she's a lot like Juri, where if you were playing at long neutral and you felt she was going to do something and you sure you can randomly, you're going to get hurt, yes, but not that much. This isn't to say anything related to if you sure you can while she's close to you or too close to you, but just like out here, you can just sure you can hear. Because nothing's likely to happen that will cause you a lot of pain unless the opponent is very, very heavily trained for this. And honestly, most people are not likely to be that heavily trained on this. You're looking at the sort of frustration player who has spent a lot of time learning optimal, longest possible range Sakura crush counter combos just because someone one day decided to uppercut everything? Totally possible, but not really the sort of thing you're going to find from most of the cast and most of the players in the game. So Ryu absolutely can just go, you know what, I'm just going to uppercut. As you can see there, spacing, micro steps, there's a whole bunch of stuff you have to learn just to be able to counter something as simple as Ryu doing walk-up uppercut to you. Juri has the same problem. Juri might have gotten over this problem and might be just overall better at it now, which is probably good for her. It's a very small but interesting buff. But if you feel you have a good handle on how to deal with your frustrating opponent, at least their main 2 or 3 frustrating strategies, then you can start pushing back on them in the psychological game. Because a frustration player, by nature, must do unsafe things. In order to do unsafe things and get away with them, you have to convince your opponent that they have no counter. Or that you aren't going to do them. The problem with most of those unsafe things is that they are really susceptible to defense. But the frustration player is good at making sure that you never feel comfortable enough just defending, which gives them the chance to get away with things like this. So first they destabilize your perception that defending is a good idea, like just blocking. And then they pick you apart with things that make you go, that shouldn't work. That's unsafe. Why would you do that? And once they've got you, you get stressed out. But there's a problem with this strategy. If you actually take on those people and take apart their two main, let's say their two main frustrating actions, by just uppercut or neutral jump, just those two things means that they don't have those two options anymore, and that means you get to block. And as soon as you get to block, you're not frustrated anymore. And you can often realize when we get back into status effects, you can understand that their goal, their mindset for how to play the game is so dependent on the idea that they can frustrate you, that they'll spend a lot of time in neutral looking for a way to do that. They'll reset themselves to situations where they can be frustrating to you. And this is a relatively heavy weakness because it allows you a lot of freedom of movement. It's very hard to condition someone who takes advantage of that much freedom of movement. As long as they feel, I can block, I can move, and I have counters to your two frustrating things. When people feel that, they're confident, they're comfortable. For the most part, they just don't hurt anymore. They might lose out on some health, they might get caught off guard by something you do, but they're not actually worried anymore. And when they're not worried anymore, frustration player tactics have to evolve quite a lot. And we reach the key point of Street Fighter at that point. Footsies. Because at that point, if you lack footsies, you can't get into the correct spaces. You just have to hit buttons. And just hitting buttons against defensive players does nothing. So you have to get there first, but once you get there, the patient player, the defensive player, starts to gain a psychological advantage that is very difficult to break outright. Because if they stop fearing certain things, their situation improves drastically, whereas the other players does not at all. It also makes them more capable of just taking a round like that one and going, okay, well, sure. Because they know that the frustration player did not do a trick. They can't necessarily just repeat that. There's nothing about that round that makes them think, oh, I got outplayed. It was just, oh, you did a couple throws instead of what I was expecting you to do. But I could beat that pretty easily, and I could deal with you if you try to do other things now, because I don't care, I don't have to let you get that. There's a lot of much calmer mental spacing that happens at that point that make it trivial, I'd say, for defensive players who are not easily forced into impatience to defend themselves in those situations. It's really hard to break them. Because these are the sort of people who will just block for 10 seconds at a time. Fortunately for Sakura, she specifically is better at dealing with this than most people. Karine, on the other hand, has more problems because Karine's long-range attack that would do this only works on people who don't have the twitch reaction to stand block it, for example. If you're really good, you deal with it entirely differently and you make sure that she gets hit for even trying. Never comes up at all. So you have to spend some time thinking about how best to get to those situations mentally, rather than learning the tech or the specific responses for your characters that will help. But we have new people in the lounge and we will start to see what they are capable of. Ken is a good player, a good character to be at least 3 different fighting styles. He's good at close-in, he's good at frustration. He's not so good at zoning, but has some good options. The odd thing is that Ken's pressure wasn't as good. Pressure here referring specifically to, I do this block string and you can't do anything. Ken has a lot of good options and paths, but none of them are basically guaranteed. You can't just do this block string and know that your opponent absolutely must respect it. And if you do, they almost never lead to anything that good. But it looks like we have another frustration player, and the reason I say that is because of the mindset it would take to jump in, get parried, and be ready for the throw tech. It means that your entire intention was either to throw the opponent when you got in the first place, or that you were being reserved about your options to begin with. Your thought of, okay, this is the thing I want to do when I get in, was not, I'm going to go for big damage. It was, I'm going to see what my opponent does and frustrate them based on that. And we see the neutral jumps as well. So, it looks like we're on frustration style players today, and let's go with that. Now, Ken is fairly easy to deal with when he's in frustration mode because all you have to do mostly is backdash away from him. He's not very good at keeping you in the corner, unlike Ryu, who actually is quite good at it, and Akuma, who can make your life miserable even though he may end up in the corner himself. Ken's not actually that good at keeping people in the corner. This is because to keep people in the corner generally requires that you have one of those aforementioned pressure strings. You need a way to make sure that they can't challenge any of your buttons, or will never want to, so that you get to keep up your own pressure on them in the corner. But Ken doesn't have this. He used to have corner throw loops, and he no longer has those either. So Ken no longer benefits heavily from cornering his opponent. Which is, I guess, sort of fair, given that he has a ton of corner carry. It also means you don't really have to worry all that hard about getting out of the corner against Ken at all. Ryu, for example, has relative ease dealing with Ken because of one of the few things I actually consider to have been a meaningful addition through that kick. Ryu's donkey kick, as it's called, Sokoto Geri, is not a phenomenal thing for dealing with Ken in general, but in the frustration matchup, it is the god button. Because you backdash away from Ken to make him unable to do things, and then Ken jumps, and then Ken gets hit by donkey kick. It's super easy, in fact. You just have to believe he's going to jump, and that's the hard part. You can backdash out of nearly everything Ken does, and when he effectively decides, I must get back in, just be ready to do that. That's the entire match at first. If he moves too close, the uppercut works to catch him. So you're not generally working out how to beat him. You are performing an action set, basically a flowchart, to keep Ken quiet. And you will get away with it most of the time. The other thing it will do, obviously, as you see here, is force Ken to occupy spaces in the air that whenever you don't feel as if he's far enough away that the kick would have been the good plan, just uppercut. In fact, the thing that's holding Amara back in this match is primarily that she's trying to zone this character when it's completely unnecessary. This player is never going to get hit by a fireball because they're never going to stay on the ground long enough to get hit by a fireball. They're just willing to jump at ambiguous ranges. But now that Ryu has that kick, he can cover those ranges too. Sakura, on the other hand, is likely to have a harder time of it.
It's go time. Let's do this.
And so, we see some Korean practice instead. Now, the interesting thing is that Karina already has this capacity. It's just that you have to be very daring about it. In order for this to work, Karine must time her Mujinkaku particularly well. None of her other options do a particularly good job. Mayokin, if you understand exactly how to space it, will catch them on the way down. And of course you can just Tenko, but can have some decent options for dealing with you intend to deal with him by instant Tenko versus this, because he's too high in the air for too long. The timing required is a bit tricky. High-level Harem players will absolutely do it though.
Is this for Tatsu or just normal jumping?
When you dash away from him and then wait and see what he does, and if he jumps.
Ah.
So all you have to do is backdash, and from there you should be able to see something. Note the jump. Note the spacing that comes up as a result of that jump. In fact, if you backdashed preemptively, you'd often be in a better spacing.
What an odd little jab storm.
It's not odd. Again, this is a frustration player.
Intended to take my focus onto that point.
Well, it worked.
It did.
You have at least 9 options in that situation, and you used none of them because you just are going, why is this person doing this? Never ask yourself that question for frustration players. Just beat it.
Fair point. But I suppose his entire goal is, in fact, just to make it so those options don't come to mind.
Pretty much.
And time for that backdashing thing.
So as you can see there, that jump spacing appears basically the same way every time. Because Ken would have to run and commit to a thing that ends up with him being punishable. The reason for this is that long, low buttons are almost impossible to defend from when you chase a backdashing opponent. If your character does not have something that actually catches the backdash, or a move that keeps their feet off the ground, they have no options. Ken can use Tatsu, but even that is sort of unsafe. Why are you fighting this person from close?
I have no idea. I was just stopping of that.
So you can see once again, if you backdash, the spacing is almost always the same. The question is, what is it that Karine does at that spacing? I don't know. You probably know better than I do. Work it out. But you're not in much danger, so you have a lot of time to work it out if you just let yourself backdash. If you attempt to hold your ground against a frustration player playing Ken, you have played wrong. And you have often played so wrong that you will lose without even feeling like you really lost or understanding why it happened.
Jeez, this
because you will do things like that, where you expect, well, he's not jumping, so that means he must have another plan. He doesn't have another plan, he just hasn't jumped yet.
Indeed.
And the reason for this is not because the player is poor. It's because Ken doesn't have options. There are no plans. There's nothing he can do. Except wait for you to give him the round.
Apparently. And it works.
Now, since this will also keep you out of nearly all of Ken's actual pressure, you don't really have to worry about anything. And this player in particular has proven to us that they're going to jump in and throw. So just backdash all of the time. Because this isn't zoning. We know this isn't zoning. We know this is a frustration player throwing fireballs to be frustrating. Not the same thing.
And it worked.
Yep. So it's easy to learn over time where exactly the flaw happens. It's not in your character's options, and it's not in your opponent's skill in the sense of their execution or their character's strength. It's your opponent getting in your head. And if you don't pay attention to how easily that happens, you get dismantled by things that when you look back at the replay, you think to yourself, how did I lose to this?
Round one.
But this isn't to say that their tactic, as I repeated from the beginning, the tactic itself is sound. They understand exactly what they are doing. It's you that doesn't. And when they do change things enough, they'll do it correctly, regardless of anything else. This is not a winning kill strategy, as noted. If you backdash, and he keeps on throwing fireballs and getting hit by Mayokins, then he will lose, right?
Eventually.
It's a losing strategy for Ken that you get confused at the fact that they're doing.
It's very hard to settle myself and, like, play the weird matchup that has been created.
That
I'm
is
so
because
unaccustomed to it.
most of us don't want to play this game. I know that's going to sound really weird. Most of us want to not lose at this game. It's a different thing. Because you have, I believe you picked Kanaha no Kata, so this person can't jump.
And yet I've completely forgotten to use it.
Forgotten that you had the move. Because your opponent was so good at making you uncomfortable that you forgot your V-trigger was a thing. That is how powerful frustration style play is.
Are you just going to feed me V-meter too?
Sure, why not? You could have won entirely by doing that. But you moved. You shouldn't have moved. Because if your opponent is willing to feed you V-meter and use up all of their own damage to do it, you could have won that probably that way entirely. You have enough meter to anti-air them if they jump in as well. Like, unambiguously, absolutely win the anti-air. No doubt whatsoever, it will be a victory.
Fast fireball. I'm just gonna sit here for now.
Well, you would lose by timeout at that point, but you have a tool for this. You know what your button for this is.
And it is that.
But if you had lost your cool, obviously you could have lost the match as well.
Very, very, very easily.
But now your opponent has no meter to actually attack you with, and you have tons of meter to anti-air them with. So they're basically dead. But you have to anti-air, right?
Yes.
And in order to make yourself anti-air, you would have to be absolutely convinced that they were going to jump. But frustration players are good at making us think they're not going to do that. I want to count that one as missed execution because I know you did that right there.
That was a 10, huh?
But now that you have that active, you can expect that they're going to try to do that. But you could easily anti-air them if they're not going to hit any buttons.
Ah!
This is why higher level players feel like these insurmountable things. Because they have learned to defeat this and stay completely calm and focused on their plan while they're doing it. They have learned, yes, you really are going to jump. Yes, you really are going to keep throwing those fireballs. And they just wait to see where exactly in the process you reset yourself and took a pause. When they learn to recognize the pauses in your game plan, they stop feeling as if your game plan has changed, and they manipulate the spacing or whatever it is to make sure that when they get that situation coming up, they don't flinch and do something they shouldn't have done. Above all else, that is the level of change you need to have in yourself to think, this pause in events that has happened does not represent a change in the match. Until it's proven to you that there is a change, just assume there isn't one. But let's look at this play, because this play should show us a lot. We know that the wolf will zone whenever possible, and will zone in ways that don't really get... This person's style doesn't deal well with that particular form of zoning. So, by most standards, they should probably fail altogether. So as you can see, they did the obvious thing that a frustration player does in that situation. They did their best to change to something new altogether. But the key here is, what is the solution to this? What is the thing you're supposed to do in this situation? Because as you can see, you can't really rely on Urian's ES headbutt. One, you will run out of meter. Two, it doesn't do enough damage. It's good for stopping it from happening, but if you repeat it, you're just gonna die anyway. So you can take a strategic look at what becomes available to me. What am I looking for here that they do repeatedly that I can take advantage of? In Urian's case, is the fact that this player's style of jump is not only one that Urian could anti-air naturally, it's also super susceptible to his high fireball. Aerial Metallic Sphere will knock this person out of the sky most of the time, I'd say. But you have to be ready and always believe in it. You have to be ready for it nearly all the time. And that is not an easy task when you are already feeling as if you are too pressured to win. Other good options? V-reversal, backdash, and any other thing. Step kick to some extent. But as you can see there, as long as you're thinking, okay, they have a different plan, they're not necessarily going to just jump. You'll never be ready for the jump because you presume that they're going to do something else. Eventually they might, but you don't have to care about that. This particular jump is something that Urian can just crouch heavy punch and actually just anti-air. I'm relatively confident, yes, that he can just anti-air that a lot of the time, if not all of the time. Most jumps, Urian has tons of trouble with, but that particular one, that particular space, terrible. And furthermore, he's one of those characters where when he backdashes, even though he doesn't get out of the range of a ton of attacks, he has a lot of immediately evasive moves that he can do. Furthermore, I think his forward medium punch is like automatically a solution to everything that's going on in this match. Like, the entire match can be won by just the forward medium punch. Because the opponent has no space in which they can win against that button. With the style they're using now. If they try to walk forward, they'll get clipped by it. And if they try to jump, they'll get clipped by it anyway. It's very active as well. So it's just an all-around solution. But until you recognize, I have an all-around solution, I can just hit this button. You can't do this. because your opponent's intention is to make you uncomfortable enough that you will never do it.
Ken wins. Let's do this.
But let's look at this from the Ryu side, because on the Ryu side, as noted, this is more difficult because Ryu has to do everything in this matchup a little faster than most people, and he has two extremely separate responses that need to happen. He has to decide effectively between doing the donkey kick and doing the shoryuken. But there's a trick to this. Just always do the shoryuken motion. Because Ryu has no shoryuken and kick move. And if you do the shoryuken motion the way a lot of people do it, where you go right to the end, you could just hit the kick instead. If your opponent is far away, shoryuken and kick. If your opponent is close, shoryuken and punch. That's it. That's the whole match. Because you no longer have to think about that. And sure, free V-meter is good. But again, the key is that you have to believe that there's a pause and not an actual problem. Your opponent's strategy has not changed. They're going to jump. You don't have to keep playing footsies. You don't have to keep them out. You just have to block, wait, and they'll jump, and there's a jump. There we go. There's some pressure. Oh, yeah. Leaving themselves open, getting beat up. And now we wait for the jump, because the jump will come. The problem is, of course, the twitch. Because that dance around that they're doing is intended to make you feel nervous. And when you feel nervous, it makes it harder to actually react in time. We've actually gone through this in recent training on Amara's side that we may share with the people in general because of how it makes Kenbot work. And there's a jump. You know the jump is coming, and you know that you could defend anything but the jump, so who cares? But Amara has recently worked out that there's a specific psychological response that makes this difficult. And let's test it out, because not only does she know that the jump will come, she also knows from recent training that she can walk under it. You can actually be hit. When Ken is trying to get into that space, walk forward. You don't have to do anything.
Ken wins.
So that's our next trick for this match, in this particular case. We're going to go from parrying fireballs, probably. Maybe they'll skip that phase at this point. But probably parrying fireballs. To holding down back. And when done holding down back, holding forward. Well, it seems that our opponent has shifted, but not something that works. So I guess you just win now?
There's the jump again.
Oh, yep, there we go. This is functionally our Kenbot. And if you understand why certain things work or don't work from fighting Kenbot, this is not really a fight per se. It is the frustration player adapting and learning what the next thing that can actually successfully frustrate you is. It's a decent option. I mean, there are lots of options you could use, and some of them will be frustrating. And this is why it works, because eventually they'll find a spacing that doesn't match your expectations anymore at all again, and make you uncomfortable. And when you're uncomfortable, you'll get to continue. But as you get more and more used to them, as you get more and more comfortable with the idea that, oh wait, I really have control of this match, don't I? It becomes easier and easier to pick them apart, because you just can't do anything anymore.
Well, they are indeed going to keep trying, it seems.
Mm-hmm. At higher levels, you get better at this and learn to reset their mental state so that they go back to doing the thing you want them to do. It's kind of easy on certain characters and harder on others. But you can, in fact, reset the opponent's mental state so that they end up doing jumps like that, for example. And you just have to recognize what makes their mental state get reset so that you can know when to expect the next thing you need to do. You can also set it up to stand in very specific places to reset their mental state. It's not really about having particular reactions at all, or doing anything. There are a lot of people you can do this to by moving to a particular spot on the screen intentionally and solving your problem that way. And when you are comfortable enough to feel all of your own options, such as, oh, they're close enough that I should sweep them, they're close enough I should crouch medium punch. Never give up your main concept, because then at that point you've messed up enough that they'll get something. But just remember that you have some other options, just so that you can feel comfortable enough to tell yourself, you know what, if I were ready enough, if I were practiced enough, you wouldn't beat me. You wouldn't be able to do this, because I wouldn't get frustrated. I wouldn't get flustered by the things you're doing. This is why it's hard for people to get past frustration players who all tend to hover at actually around the same level until they make a certain breakthrough in their minds. But it's equally hard for the frustration player to level up more for the same reason. Everyone above them just deals with this. Everyone above them just goes, I've seen this before. I don't have the mental state that causes me to lose in this situation. I have surpassed that state. And by surpassing that state, they'll get taken by surprise for maybe round one and then realize, oh, you're this type of player. Okay. And then just play through the rest of them. It's very difficult to take rounds as a frustration player against people who don't get frustrated. And in order to frustrate higher level players, you have to have a lot of tech. Again, I don't really want to call it tech because it's specifically misleading mindsets, misleading intentions, yes.
Round one.
Having the misleading intentions is practically a requirement for this.